Hello and welcome to Liquid, New Hampshire. This is episode 3. I am here with my friend Connor. My friend Connor is a relatively apolitical dude. He's been wanting to get more into politics recently, and I figured I'd talk to him and give him an idea of what the basic groups are in politics, and at the same time maybe helping people in the audience understand where their values are, who they might want to align with in politics. So I've built you basically a political spectrum.
Okay.
Right off the bat, this is not going to be perfect. Politics is incredibly complicated.
Absolutely.
There are going to be a bunch of people probably being like, well, that's not a perfect explanation, you know? But I think it gives you a rough idea of where everybody's coming from. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to give you kind of 3 camps that are broadly on the right, and then 3 camps that are broadly on the left. And I want to show you how these forces kind of shape the mainstream Republicans and the mainstream Democrats.
Okay.
So that's what this is. This is 3 on the right, 3 on the left, Democrats and Republicans here. Alright? So historically, there was, way back in the day, there was a divide even during the French Revolution. And if you want to know where the terms left and right come from, it actually comes from during the French Revolution when the revolutionaries sat on the left and the people who sort of wanted to maintain the monarchy sat on the right.
Interesting.
So way back then, there was a debate during the Enlightenment, even prior to the founding of our country, between 2 big thinkers who I think, actually maybe I'll write these guys down, but they're 2 big thinkers, I'll just say them, Edmund Burke and I think it was Rousseau. I think Rousseau was the other one. Edmund Burke and Rousseau, right?
Okay.
So Burke was a conservative. And his type of conservatism was basically literally adhering to tradition, maintaining the status quo. Right? He thought that ideas in your head aren't worth very much. You can come up with all the ideas you want. You can come up with an idea for an airplane, right? But that doesn't mean it's going to fly. You have to know it works in practice.
I see.
So he said, well, look at our society today. We know it works in practice because we're doing it. And so all these people who have these newfangled ideas, maybe they'll work, maybe they won't, but you won't know until you've really practiced them and lived them out. So he generally erred on the side of caution when it came to any kind of change, whereas Rousseau basically thought that everything in society was up in the air. Anything in society can be changed, and it's just a matter of ideas, you know?
Okay.
So that was sort of the original left versus right. As far as I can tell, that's the farthest back I can trace our modern Democrats and Republicans. But there were some complications along the way. For example, way back when the country started, there was really only one party, the Democrats, and the Republicans started later. And when the Republicans started, they were started by people like Jefferson. And Jefferson had just a different view of the Constitution. He was more on the side of sort of states' rights, and he was also more on the side of small government. But that was early on, and those issues weren't the big ones. He was a part of a group of farmers that really valued self-reliance. And what's interesting about this part of political history is that it kind of continues into today, but it also kind of doesn't on the right. That idea of self-reliance, of owning your own farm, because that's what it originally was. It was literally you own your own farm, and you have your own income from your own farm, from your own property.
It's like self-sustainment.
Exactly. Self-sustaining agriculture, and that was Jefferson's type of people. That doesn't really exist today. On the right or the left, there's pretty much nobody who defends that group anymore.
Yeah.
Except maybe me.
Nowadays, farmers usually start farms in order to make money, so they can sell to local grocers and continue the agriculture that they started up, just so they can distribute, not self-sustain.
Well, it's also so many of the farms are big farms.
Yeah.
You know, it's not one person in their family living off the farm feeding themselves. It's a big farm feeding a ton of people on an industrial scale.
Right.
And at the same time, his vision of government was also very local and very decentralized, whereas today government itself is much larger. So this camp on the right that I call the Agrarian Conservatives are anyone who is around today who really, their passion comes from that farm life, that sort of culture, and that self-reliance. So the only group I can really think of that's really in line with this value, they call themselves distributists. They're somewhat rare in politics, but there are a couple of groups in New Hampshire that are distributists.
Oh.
Most of them are Catholics, and they're very religious, and that's the other thing that I would say this group defines on the right. They tend to be very religious, and their value system comes from religious conservatism.
Okay.
So if you've ever seen debates on the right about like abortion or gay marriage, I would say that that religious right, I would put them in this group here.
Okay.
And then the second group that makes up the right is libertarians, and then more recently anarcho-capitalists. So libertarians come from a school of thinkers. It started with Hayek and Mises were two of the names, the big name thinkers. They were writing in debate with socialists way back in the day, right? So they were debating economic planning, and they had to come up with a line of arguments as to why it doesn't work, why it fails. And they came up with arguments about human knowledge for the most part. Their arguments were you cannot from the top down get the kind of information that you need from the people at the bottom to make good decisions.
Oh, I see.
So they had what they called the local knowledge problem. And in general, I would say this is why libertarians sort of err towards skepticism of like objective truth and science a lot of the time. Not that the average libertarian is like a super anti-science person, but they're just generally of the belief that the government cannot come up with good facts and information in order to make and impose policy on everyone. They kind of think everyone has to find truth for themselves as an individual.
I see.
So their camp became really prominent. It used to be sort of the minority, right? This used to be the dominant camp on the right. And then their camp became more prominent in recent years with this guy, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is a big name. If you want to learn about right-wing politics, Milton Friedman is probably the guy to read. He is the biggest advocate for free markets probably ever. And he's a funny guy. I actually know his son and grandson a little bit because his whole family is involved in libertarian politics. And we live in the state of New Hampshire, which is where everybody is moving here for what's called the Free State Project. Have you ever heard of that, by the way?
I've heard that name, but I don't know what it really means.
It's a group of libertarians who literally said, you know, if you get enough people who want to live in the same place together voluntarily, right, you can have influence over their government. So they chose a small state, New Hampshire, and they urged as many libertarians as possible to move here. And they created funds that help people move here, and they're like, let's just have a bunch of people move to New Hampshire. So we have a ton of libertarians that consciously moved here to change the government. And so, depending on where you are in the political spectrum, you either love or hate the Free State movement's influence on New Hampshire. Yeah, so his family, every member of the family, writes about politics, right? And writes about the economy. Milton Friedman is super famous because he came up with a concept called neoliberalism. And that concept became influential for policymaking with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So he's the ideas man behind Reagan and Thatcher, and that's sort of how our economy started to move away from post-war, where we had a lot of heavy investment by the government in industry, to more privatized, more free market economics. And his son, David Friedman, went on to coin the term anarcho-capitalist, which is nowadays a very, very popular group among libertarians who they just take libertarianism sort of to its natural conclusion and say, well, we're a kind of anarchism, right? We're a kind of anarchism that says we want to dissolve the government entirely into fully voluntary relations. They would call themselves voluntarists.
Interesting.
So those are two groups on the right, and you can see how both of those kind of fuse into Republicans. Because if you talk to your average Republican, they have libertarian ideas, they have free market ideas, but they also tend to have opposition to gay marriage, opposition to abortion, a love of farmers and rural people in general. So it all kind of fuses into this, right? And then up here we have nationalists. Now, this is a part of the right that maybe the other parts of the right want to avoid association with sometimes.
Okay.
Because if you go far enough in the nationalist direction, I would say that's where Nazis are.
Oh, I see.
This is where you get your Nazis and your fascists, is like up in this corner. But you can also have people who are maybe a bit more moderately nationalistic, depending on who you ask. I would say Donald Trump represents a shift in mainstream Republican discourse from mostly talking about this stuff to mostly talking about this stuff.
Okay.
Nationalism is not so preoccupied with liberty. They tend to want to centralize more power. For example, Trump wants to sort of concentrate more decision making in the executive branch and in the president. They would argue that it makes it more efficient. They would argue that it's good to have a sort of an ideological government. That's why they want to get rid of what they call the deep state, which are government employees in the bureaucracy who have been around for decades and decades. And they have expertise that is neither left nor right necessarily. And so a lot of people will be like, well, these people are really running the government and they're unelected. So that's why a lot of them have that distaste towards bureaucracy and sort of, they're more authoritarian, you could say, a lot of the time, for better or for worse. And their other big issue is anti-immigration, right? That is the big one for nationalists, is they define the nation either by its people, if they're like a white nationalist way over here, or with Trump, something more like citizenship. Because you see a lot of Trump supporters, it's not all like white people, right? You know, there's sort of a multiracial American citizens movement going on with Trump, right? One of the books I read by Brian Kaplan, an anarcho-capitalist, actually called it Citizenism, which I think was a pretty good name for what's going on with this people.
Okay.
So you take all three of those, and I think that gives you the modern right today. How are you feeling about this so far?
That's interesting. That's a lot of information. Stuff I've never heard of before. Like, especially with the conservatives, this distributors, never heard of that term before.
Oh yeah, and that's a group I really like to read because I'm sort of a localist. I've advocated secession. I also advocate devolving more power to local government. And I kind of feel like a big problem that we sort of allowed to happen over the years is that the right wing became about being opposed to big government above all else. And in practice, they sort of stripped away a lot of the defense mechanisms we have against big corporations.
Yeah.
And the left became very against big corporations, but not so much against big government. So we end up with highly centralized, concentrated government and business, which I would argue is a bad thing. I think we need kind of small government and small business. So that brings me to the left, right? Over here, so actually let's start with these labels here. Classical liberals and social liberals. So I told you before about Burke and Rousseau and that divide. That sort of spawned a broader divide in liberal thought. I should clarify, liberal as a term in political theory does not mean Democrats. Liberal kind of just means anybody who was around during the Enlightenment and wanted like democracy and some degree of constitutionalism. So all of our founding fathers probably would have called themselves capital L liberals.
Okay.
So people to the right, to the left, however you want to classify them, they don't really perfectly fit in modern day right and left categories, but they would all be under the broad category of liberal, which is why their divide was between classical liberals, who tended to want sort of a smaller welfare state and less social spending, and social liberals who believed in a more that rights in the classical sense, that you have a right to vote, stuff like that. They believed that that extended to having certain basic economic rights for the very poor or the very disabled.
Okay.
And you can kind of see how that divide, again, manifests as modern Republicans and Democrats. So another bit of history here that I think is interesting is the progressive movement. So the progressive movement, don't know who started it, but Teddy Roosevelt is a very famous advocate, and he started the Progressive Party in America. It didn't take off as a major third party, but that party was advocating for, again, very, very religious values, which is kind of interesting. And they were actually the people who got prohibition passed.
Oh, okay.
So I think it's interesting that historically, if you look at the progressives as a group, you're looking at a very, very religious group of people who advocated for prohibition. So it's kind of a weird history there, where that doesn't really align with today's idea of a progressive.
Yeah.
But they also wanted a lot more regulation of industry. They didn't like big industry being able to do whatever it wanted. They wanted the government to regulate it more. And they were also the advocates of antitrust. So that's where you have a business that is so large that it's the only one in an industry, and it's a monopoly, and the government steps in and breaks it up.
Okay, do you have an example of that?
So back in the day, I think it was the railroads, and I think that was one of the first big trusts. That might not be perfectly accurate. No, so the railroads was actually, they did national regulation for that. That was the progressive strategy there, was they passed national regulation, so we have standards for where the railroads go and how the railroads function. Because they wanted to have that sort of standardized across the country, so that everybody could use them as a resource.
Kind of like a public transportation
Yes.
type?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like, and I don't know how much public investment there really was in railroads, but they did sort of rigidly control the industry, and they wanted to make sure, I think one of the problems also was they didn't want multiple competitors using the same lines.
That would be strange.
Because literally, they had problems, I think, with literal train collisions, with multiple competitors trying to use the same train
rough
lines.
start.
So I think that's that. Talk about extreme competition in your business, Connor.
Jeez. Wow.
Yeah, so that's a weird history. I forget what the big one was, because it wasn't. It's very well known. I'll have to look it up afterwards. But there was some big industry that was broken up by the trust busters, they called them.
Okay.
And so to this day, antitrust tends to be advocated more by the left, and government regulation tends to be advocated more on the left. The value of prohibition, though, and the religiosity has sort of mostly faded away on the left. But I'll get back to it a little bit later, that I think there is still a little bit of that sentiment on the left, actually. Let's talk about the commies. Let's talk about me and my commies. Anarcho-communists and Marxist-Leninists. So I have those as sort of the extremes on the left here. I've set this up so it's sort of libertarian, moderate, maybe a bit authoritarian, right? And then on the left here, this is a bit more moderate, the progressives, and then anarcho-communists are like the libertarian left. So anarcho-communists are part of a history of advocating local direct democracy and sort of horizontal governance. I would say a good model for understanding anarcho-communists is kind of what indigenous people had before the United States came around. They advocate very reciprocal, they also advocate moneyless society, very horizontal, no overarching power structure. So their worldview is a little bit different from the type of communists that you might be more familiar with historically, who obviously they seized control of the government and they had more of a top-down state, right, where they actually tried to plan the economy. Anarcho-communists, I think, would say that they're like following Marx's vision immediately. They are immediately moving to a stateless, classless, moneyless society.
Okay.
Whereas Marxist-Leninists would say that they're trying to sort of gradually get there, and that the first step is taking control of the state and redirecting it to their goals, right? And one of those goals is economic planning. So today, we do have Marxist-Leninist groups like the PSL. I'm probably going to have a PSL member on as a guest because I know some of them. And there are also anarcho-communist groups, but by their nature, they tend not to have names and formal organizations.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, actually.
Because they're anarchists.
Right.
So they just kind of freely associate. And when an organization comes together or disbands, it just kind of happens. Just kind of like
Very
flowing
free-flowing.
water, you know? So those are the main camps on the left. One thing I should note about the Marxist-Leninists historically is I think that they have a tendency to be more, they have a more authoritarian view of the economy, right? So if you look at the economy for anarcho-communists, it is literally, if you just let people be free in a moneyless society, they'll figure it out, right? That's kind of their idea.
Okay.
For progressives, they're talking more about using the government to regulate industry a little bit more. And then you go all the way up to Marxist-Leninists, and they're talking about taking all industry fully under state control to make decisions centrally. So those are the main camps on the left and the right. Oh, and there's another historical tidbit I wanted to talk about the right, because this comes up, and I think it's very funny. I actually had a conversation with my mom about this, where a lot of Republicans, weirdly, specifically it's usually a counter-argument to accusations of racism. A lot of them will say, well, how can we be racist? Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So historically, that is true. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. There was also a very complicated history with the parties switching, basically.
I see.
So the Democrats were what was called the Dixiecrats. The Democrats were super pro-segregation back in the day. And then the Republicans, under, I forget who the leadership was, they came up with, Lee Atwater, that's his name. Lee Atwater came up with what's called the Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy was, we're going to win over voters by appealing to people we don't usually appeal to, and we're going to appeal to the Dixiecrats down in the South. So we're going to take our platform and we're going to appeal to segregationists. And then over the years, as a result, Republicans during that period of time became the pro-segregations, and the Democrats became the anti-segregation group.
Okay.
So that's how that sort of divide switched, where Republicans freed the slaves and then fought for Jim Crow.
Oh.
Which is a weird history, right? I should also note of that the Democrats, there's a faction I didn't really put on here, and I probably should have because it's very important. Even though they don't really have a historical name, I would say the New Left might be a good name for them. They are the people who fought for civil rights for the most part. I would say it's the cultural movements, right? So
Okay.
It's civil rights, it's feminism, it's the gay rights.
That's the side that I'm actually aware of, which is why I'm surprised that you had brought these 3 points up that I've never heard of.
Yeah.
Seem a little more radical than I'm used to when people refer to the left.
That's a good point. Yeah, because these are the groups that I think of, and I think probably those are the groups I think of because those are political and economic coalitions.
Yeah.
Whereas pretty much everyone on the left ends up siding with the social justice movements a lot of the time. Oh yeah, so I wanted to also talk a little bit about a couple of centrists. A couple of centrist ideologies, because I wanted to give you a couple of ideas that aren't just left and right.
Right.
So I've got radical centrism here, which is an idea that has gained recent traction with the campaign of Andrew Yang. Radical centrism, originally, I think it actually kind of comes from a Burkean idea, which was that, like I said earlier, society can't just be changed with ideas in your mind. They kind of applied that, I think, to the left and the right, and they kind of say, well, the left is locked in, the right is locked in. We've seen these partisan struggles go on for however many years, like 50 years or something. So they're like, let's not pretend we're going to make the right left or the left right anytime soon. Let's just start with everybody believes what they believe and try to find what we can do to move forward. So they talk about modernization in government. They talk about doing away with bureaucracy. They talk about stuff that kind of everyone can probably get behind,
Okay.
left or right.
So kind of like a compromise in the form of politics.
Yes.
Okay.
And there are a lot of people who are not radical centrists who end up functionally trying to do the same thing. Joe Biden is probably in this area. A lot of mainstream Democrats and Republicans for a long time, they run on a platform of, I'm willing to reach across the aisle and shake hands. What they mean when they say that is, I'm willing to get stuff done before doing sort of partisan stuff, pushing in one direction or another.
I see.
So similarly, you know, radical centrism is similar, but it's a more ideological group, where they've actually come up with, like, owning it and publicly proclaiming we are centrists. And they've also started to come up with their own sorts of ideas, and I would say they're very similar to technocracy, which is why I put them in here. Andrew Yang, for example, one of his big ideas, his biggest idea is UBI. That's what everybody knows him for, which is universal basic income, giving everybody $1,000 a month unconditionally.
Wow.
Yes, so that's his big idea, and he says it's neither a left-wing or a right-wing idea. If you look at it historically, Milton Friedman from over here, right, advocated a UBI. So did Martin Luther King, and so did a number of socialists. So there's like a weird bipartisan coalition of people from the right and the left alike. Oh, here's another one. Charles Murray, probably up in this area, he wrote The Bell Curve, which is the book talking about race and IQ statistics. He's that guy.
Okay.
So he's the guy who said that he believes different races have different IQs, and he wrote another book arguing to dismantle welfare for racism reasons, I would say, right? He wanted to dismantle welfare, and his replacement was UBI. Because in his eyes, welfare keeps people trapped in poverty. You give people money because they're poor, right? UBI doesn't keep people trapped that way. You give money to everyone, rich and poor alike. So if you're poor and you're on welfare, you might not want to get a job because you'll lose your welfare. Charles Murray says, well, no, if you had a UBI instead, then you would still want to go and get a job, because now you're getting $1,000 a month, or however much a month, right? And you're getting money from your job. So you're not losing anything by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Okay.
So that's why that idea Andrew Yang thinks has bipartisan traction. And his other big idea that he talks about is sort of evidence-based government. He's a very facts guy, which is why I put him kind of up, but in the middle. He's very objective in that way. So he would do things, one of his proposals was wellness credits, which is literally giving people money for going to therapy or doing things for their mental health, right? So he's like, if we want something, if we think it's good, let's incentivize it through the government. So it's kind of a weird place to be in left and right wise, because he's very much saying there is a conception of what a good life is, and we know what it is, and we can approach it scientifically. That's the other thing is, I've actually seen people talk about his platform before, and I thought the way they talked about it was pretty silly, because they didn't Google the words they were using. They looked up his platform, and his platform said stuff like evidence-based policy making. And they were like, everybody says they do evidence-based policy making. And I'm like, no. He wants to hire researchers to make the policy based purely on evidence and not on ideology. Like, it's kind of completely different. It's not just saying I have the evidence. It's like a delegation to the experts to make the policy. And that's where you get technocracy. Technocracy is ruled by experts. It's not ruled by technology. It's ruled by, like, anyone with relevant expertise.
Okay.
So that's where you get, I would say that to an extent, our entire bureaucracy. is a little bit of technocracy when the legislature says the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, you guys are in charge of figuring out which drugs are good and which drugs are bad.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically doing a little bit of technocracy. They're doing a little bit of, we're going to rely on the experts to make these regulations for us because we're just politicians. We don't know everything about food and drug science.
Right.
That is the basic overall spectrum, but I think there's a couple of values as well that define us. So we've got the left over here and the right over here, and we just put libertarians in the middle for simplicity's sake, but they're probably a bit more down, right? On the left, I think we have economic rationalism as a core value, and that's why I think, to an extent, prohibition kind of makes sense, having been on the left, actually.
Yeah.
Because if you look at today, you'll have like critics on the left of big pharma, critics of opioid sales, right? They'll say that the pharmaceutical industry is a big corporation, it wants to make money, and so it's sort of controlling our government influence and lobbying our government to get more pills prescribed to the public, get more people addicted, make more money.
I see.
So there's a very strong left-wing criticism of big corporations, criticism of capitalism, brand of criticism of drugs and other cultural issues. So there's a way in which I think prohibition makes sense from just a pro-regulation, economic rationalism perspective. And the reason I say rationalism is because libertarians would say, well, how do you know? You know, why are you deciding for us what to take and not to take? Libertarians would say that should be your choice. You want to take opiates? You know, there are lots of people who are in pain that our system denies opiates to. They have chronic pain and doctors tell them, well, I can't figure out what's wrong with you, so you don't get to have drugs. And then they live their life in pain. So they would say that it's important to be skeptical of anyone who's trying to say, we know exactly what these drugs do, what they don't do, and it just allow individuals to make decisions for themselves.
Right.
Similarly, on the right, I think there's a cultural rationalism. I don't often hear people describe it this way, but I think it's a really good way to describe sort of family values right, is they're trying to come up with what a good life is, what the best way to be as a person is, and maybe for them that's like traditional marriage. And then if you don't end up within that vision of a good life, like if you're gay, for example, obviously traditional heterosexual marriage isn't going to work for you.
Mm.
So they're trying to come up with a sort of objective conception of a good cultural life.
Okay.
And then sort of enforce that. Like marriage would be an incentive structure. You get money when you're married. At least historically you used to. Sharing your finances was a benefit of marriage. And in fact, when the gay rights movement was talking about gay marriage, one of the big issues was that it was just economically unfair, that there were a lot of benefits to marriage that were being denied to gay people.
Right.
Similarly, on the right, they believe very strongly in meritocracy. So this is part of why I said Andrew Yang's credits were kind of a centrist idea, because you might think, oh, he's giving people money for mental health. That kind of sounds like a left-wing idea.
Yeah.
But I would argue that it's maybe also a little bit of a right-wing idea, because the right wing tends to prefer incentivizing people. They like rewarding people for hard work, they like rewarding people for doing good, and they like punishing people for doing bad. And I would say that's also where their criminal justice views come from,
Right.
is punishment for when you do bad. Whereas on the left, and this is another sort of poorly articulated value, I think this is a really good one, I think, to get into. Because I think most people would say that the left is defined by equality, which I don't think gets at it. I think if you talk to any left-winger, they're like, well, I don't know if that's really the root of things, right? The root of things isn't so much equality for its own sake. I think the real root of things is opportunity. So I would say that when you have a kid, let's say, and you're raising your child, You don't give your kid food and housing and an education because they've earned it, because they've worked hard.
Right.
You don't give your kid all that stuff because you think that they've done a good job and they deserve rewards for it. You do it because you think that kid is going to become something in the future, right? If I give my kid a good education unconditionally, then it will benefit them in the future.
Okay.
So that's where a lot of sort of the free stuff element of the left comes from, right? I believe personally in like free higher education. And it's the same idea. It's if you offer everybody higher education at a lower price, more people are going to take you up on it, more people are going to get it, and we're going to have a smarter, more educated society as a result.
Right.
So yeah, that's my explanation. What are you wondering? What do you got for lingering questions?
Wow. Most of my questions were answered already, actually. You did a pretty good job of covering the basis of everything here, especially at this part, because this kind of summed everything up. And that's
Okay.
where most of my questions would lie, because they were individual based on each section.
Mhm.
But describing it in such a concrete way gave those questions the light. So I don't really have any. It's more like how people define what side they actually lean on. Some people they say they're mostly left wing, or they have right wing ideas,
Right.
but then they just quantify themselves as left wing.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody usually has some kind of idea that stems on both sides,
Right,
but they're
right.
not centrists. They're leaning towards.
That's true. Well,
So it's kind of hard to define on some people's ends what they really are.
I think a lot of it is the two-party system,
Yeah.
right? As somebody who's advocating for not having two parties, for
Yeah.
having liquid democracy and having all of these factions. That's one of the things I think is beautiful, actually, about liquid democracy, or even just about ranked choice voting, which is another system people advocate to move away from two parties and to give third parties more of a chance. I think a thing that's beautiful about that is that you get all of these stripes and flavors.
Right.
You don't just get Democrats or Republicans, you get the weirdies. You get the ones with the weird stripes. Like right now, there's a third party called the Unity Party. That's Andrew Yang is trying to work together with Democrats and Republicans and form a third party for centrism. So
that would
there's
actually make sense to me.
And there's already a third party for just liberty, right? Where they'll say, you know, we're pro, they're usually pro-choice and pro-gay marriage,
Yep.
pro-weed legalization, pro-sex work decriminalization, you know, so they're pro all the freedoms, just all of them,
Liberty,
across
yeah.
the board.
That
And
makes
so
sense.
that's a lot of culturally left-wing stuff,
Yep.
but then they're also opposed to taxes, generally. They want as low of taxes
So
as
pretty
possible.
much just freedom is what they want.
Just freedom.
They want to be free.
As much freedom as possible.
That makes sense.
At their core, I think if you go far enough into libertarianism, you get something called the non-aggression principle, which is they believe that you shouldn't murder anyone else or steal their property, but as long as you're not murdering anyone else or stealing their property, literally everything else is on the table.
Wow.
So they're very, very, if you get far enough, you get very, very
It gets a
libertarian.
little, okay.
I even made a video on this channel called Legalize Murder.
I remember that, yeah, that's
And
like the first one,
Part
right?
of the joke there was like, well, if you really go really far into libertarian, then why not allow people to murder too? And just trust that they won't? Because that's what a lot of it comes down to, trust of people.
Right.
That's what a lot of it comes down to. And, this is another thing, good thing to mention, on the economic rationalism side. One of the things that drew me towards the left was behavioral economics.
Mm-hmm.
Behavioral economics takes as its starting point the idea that in mainstream economics, the economics that you learned in school, everything is based on a vision of a human being that they call Homo economicus. So it's a sort of theoretical version of a human being. And all of their models are based on this is how a human being behaves, right?
Okay.
And in order to make the economic models work, in order to make them sort of scientific and reproducible, and you can use them again and again and get the same results, they had to make a version of the human being that was perfectly self-interested, so they only act in their own like selfish self-interest, and also perfectly rational, and they have perfect information. So they make the right choice for themselves every time perfectly, and they have all of the information in the world about what they're doing. And that's deeply inaccurate to the human being.
Oh.
So literally, if you look at like the idea of a free market,
yeah.
I think the debate is how much do we trust people to make good decisions for themselves?
Yeah.
Because you go far enough on the free market side, and there are some people who will want to get rid of even food safety regulations, because they're like, well, people can decide for themselves. If they go to a business and it has toxic food or rat poop or something, right? They can just go, ew, that's gross. Maybe post it on their social media so the information gets out there, and then other people go, ew, that's gross. And then they don't eat there anymore, and then the business goes out of business, so the problem kind of solves itself. Whereas on the left, they would be like, well, no, people don't know what they're getting when they buy it. You know, we don't want people eating rat poop and not knowing it. Some chemicals are so small you can't see them. So the left emphasizes the lack of information, whereas the right is sort of, I would say, embracing the Homo economicus model more of, no, people generally have good information and can make good decisions for themselves. The left is more like, we're more rational than you think. We have addictions, we're short-sighted, etc.
Okay.
Oh, that could be another good divide to talk about, is Social Security and Medicare, because those are two of the biggest government programs that exist right now, other than, I think, the military, probably. And those were the greatest reduction in poverty ever. And I would say the reason for that is the exact left-wing criticism of human nature, because what they had was they had a lot of old people who were suffering and poor, like during the Great Depression.
Yep.
They had hobos, those were poor old people, a lot of them. And then they created programs, Medicare and Social Security, which are both directly targeted at giving old people resources. Medicare is for their health care, Social Security is for their retirement, but they're both targeted at people over 65.
Right.
And it worked. It made a lot of old people a lot less poor. So I would say that that's an example that we needed to realize that people aren't going to save for their own retirement very well, that people can't see ahead that far, sort of rationally, and that we needed to create a government program to solve for that. Yeah. Whereas the right would kind of, even today, the right would say, well, we're spending too much money on Medicare, spending too much money on Social Security, we're taxing people too heavily for it. We need to trust people to save for themselves, sort of pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Right.
Yeah, are there any, let me see, probably issues might be good to talk about, right? Because there are specific issues that fall to the left and to the right. Let me think here. Like let's do immigration. That's a great example, I think, actually, of this value system divide in practice, right? So for immigration, the right, generally anti-immigration, libertarians, pro-immigration, and the left, also pro-immigration. But kind of for different reasons, I would say. So on the right, the main reason for being against immigration is scarcity. The goal is, there are limited resources to spend on immigrants. There are also limited jobs to go around. And so if you restrict the number of people coming into the country, you restrict the number of people taking those jobs from Americans, or those welfare or what have you from Americans.
Yeah.
So their argument is kind of rooted in meritocracy in that way. It's a lot of the people they'll let in terms of legal immigrants are people who can prove that they're working, or prove that they have an education, prove that they've sort of earned it, right? Whereas libertarians, they're coming at it more from a skeptical perspective, so they would talk about the failures of trying to enforce it. They would talk about, you can try to kick people out, but it just doesn't work, right? We don't know how to prevent people from coming in. And also they would say that there are limitations, like for example, Brian Kaplan. He is an anarcho-capitalist, and he wrote a book about open borders, advocating for it. And he says that the border is a problem, a solution in search of a problem, is the phrase he uses. So he gives a bunch of examples of things he calls keyhole solutions that he thinks would be better than border security. Things like, let's say you have people coming into the country and you decide the problem is crime. You decide that the problem is that immigrants coming into the country commit more crime. He says, okay, police them harder. He goes, now I think that's unfair. He goes, but I actually think it's less unfair than deporting people. So he gives that sort of line, right? And then he'll say, okay, do you think they hurt the economy? Tax them more. He goes, again, I think that's unfair, but I think it's less unfair than deportation and sort of more pragmatic.
Okay, that makes more sense.
That's an argument libertarians use a lot, actually, is if we have a problem, let's kind of take a step back and say, how can we solve this problem while minimally violating people's liberty? So they would make an argument from freedom of movement. That would be their core argument for immigration. And they would probably say that it's always a two-way street, right? You can move to another country for job opportunities, they can move here for job opportunities, and that general freedom is beneficial. So for them, it's a free flow and it's a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
For the left, it's slightly different. Libertarians also advocate free trade. The left is a lot more critical of free trade. And here's where you start to get at the difference. The left would say that big corporations have an easier time moving from region to region, from country to country, and they use that advantage to find the cheapest workers possible from all over the world. And at the same time, they're pushing down people's wages, right? If you find cheaper work elsewhere, then the goal becomes, oh, how can I make workers here get paid less so the jobs will come back?
Right.
So they're trying to find as cheap of labor as possible, and the left would say immigration can be a counterbalance to that. They would say we need to restrict corporations moving so much internationally, and we need to help immobile labor move more internationally. So they would say, if you're poor and you're in another country, you want to get more money, move to where the jobs are better. So for them, it's a war between corporations and workers, where the goal is to push upwards and have wages go higher.
Okay.
At the same time, I think the other big left-wing argument would be, like I said, opportunity. So opportunity would mean, for example, wealthier, more industrialized nations, the same worker can produce more with less effort. So if you're living in like a hut out in another country, you're not going to be able to produce nearly as much with 8 hours of labor as you are in America with big machinery that you're working with.
Oh yeah.
So for them, again, opportunity becomes a big part of their argument as opposed to liberty. But a lot of times you'll find that when there's a coalition like that, where they agree on an issue, like libertarians and the left agree on immigration, they'll just borrow arguments from one another. The left will be like, oh, it's about freedom of movement too. They'll say the same thing,
Right.
Yeah, are there any issues maybe that you've seen in the news that you watched or you heard something about a politician and you were like, why did that happen? How did that come to be?
I don't really stay up to date on a lot of the news articles that talk about political issues. I do run into the same amount of complaints though when it comes to Trump or Biden. I see equal complaints on both ends, but I don't really see a lot of good stuff.
Oh yeah,
which I think is hilarious to me.
There's not a lot of good stuff.
Yeah. Other than that, I do have actually one question about that immigration thing.
Mm-hmm.
What does centrism stand?
Ooh, yeah.
Now that it's new, does it even have a stance? Or is it kind of on both sides of...
I think that as a movement, radical centrists probably don't have a strongly defined position, but I can tell you that Andrew Yang was pretty anti-immigration leaning. He actually agreed with Trump on a lot. It seemed like And he would actually go out to MAGA rallies and Democrat events. And when he would go to MAGA rallies, he would talk about immigration, he would talk about border security, and he would win people over. I should note that there are a lot of centrists love to try and find win-win solutions. That's their whole deal.
Oh yeah.
Right? Their whole deal is if we can find a win-win solution, these ideological divides won't matter anymore.
That's
so
fair.
when it comes to immigration, I have seen some centrists try to come up with win-win solutions. One of them was like a lottery system that guarantees a certain number of slots, the exact number of immigrants that we need, or something like that.
Okay, kind of like a balance, but they're using numbers.
Exactly. They're using like hard data and numbers to try and be like, here's the exact correct immigration strategy.
That is such a strange, yet also kind of enticing way to do things.
It is.
That's
it's
very weird.
It's like nerdy, and it's like, how much do we trust the nerds is the real question.
Yeah. Hey, sometimes you have to.
You do. You gotta trust the nerds. Our whole government probably only exists in the modern day because we trusted the nerds. We used to have all laws were made through the legislature, and these days a lot more of it is done by the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So we had to trust the nerds to survive.
And you know what? I think I've got a stance. I think we should just trust the nerds.
Yeah.
If science got us this far, maybe it's time to let them take a crack at politics, huh?
And you know, the cool thing about technocracy, because there is a lot I like about technocracy. The cool thing about technocracy is I think that it also advocates government nerds, right? So if you've got your science nerds on the science issues, right? Technocracy is also saying, how can we have the best politicians? How can we have politicians who know what it is to be a good politician?
Yeah.
So they'll advocate, you know, if you want somebody to be in power on a national level, they'll be like, that person should be in their town government, and then they should be in their state government, and then they should go to college for political science, and then they should serve in the national government. They should do all this other stuff first and work their way up. So they're very big proponents of having people have as much qualifications as possible.
Yeah.
The other side of that, the opposite of that, would be sort of populism. Populism is a good term, maybe to go over. Populism is the people versus the elites. That's the meaning of populism. It's less a political view and more a way of doing politics. And I think a lot of people today would say populism is on the rise. They would call Trump a populist, and they would also call Bernie Sanders a populist. So both of them would say that the problem in this country is a sort of small elite of people who are out of touch with the majority of ordinary people, and that the majority of ordinary people need to take the country back.
Yeah.
The difference is that Bernie Sanders would probably say it's the rich or the capitalists, and Trump would probably say it's sort of the highly educated academic left, or the deep state, or those sorts of groups.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty solid introduction.
Indeed.
I think I've got you an intro to politics. I'm excited to have you on again, though.
Absolutely.
And talk more about how these play out in real life. I think what we'll do for next time is we'll choose a couple of real world issues, and we'll see if we can plot them and make sense of them.
That would be cool. That would give me an opportunity to at least give it a shot. Seeing as I'm still new to this, learning all this information will give me a chance to understand a little bit about each side.
Hell yeah.
By taking those things and trying. You can correct me if I'm wrong, absolutely.
Oh yeah.
And I probably will be wrong.
And I'm always trying to make an effort to, if I'm going to make a correction, be like, also, here are where my facts came from, and they might be biased.
I'm cool with that. I like facts.
Absolutely.
So, thanks for having me
Alright.
on, man.
Anytime.